Hi everybody, welcome back. Today we are going to look at Chapter 4. In Chapter 3 we talked about markets in general, the markets for goods and services. So things like buying groceries and gasoline, services like going to a mechanic or hiring a lawyer or buying clothes. And a lot of markets can be described in the way we talked about in the last chapter. A lot of goods and services fit into that model that we talked about in the market for goods and services. But today, we're going to talk about labor markets and financial markets because even though they use the same framework as the market for goods and services, they're going to have a little bit of variation. And it's a great way to both practice the markets for goods and services models and add a new layer of complexity and something kind of interesting by looking at the specific ways that labor markets are kind of different, hiring and firing workers, and financial markets, borrowing and lending. So let's go ahead and dive in and take a look. It's Chapter 4 in the OpenStax textbook, and there's not a lot of terminology. Minimum wage, which you probably already are familiar with, interest rate, also probably already familiar with, and then usury laws, which is just a kind of fine note about financial markets, rules about interest rates and limits on interest rates that banks can charge. So grab your slides, grab your notes, grab your textbook, and let's get started. Okay, here we are in Chapter 4, Labor in Financial Markets. And so what we're going to be looking at here in this chapter, we're going to talk about demand and supply in labor markets first, looking at how we derive and shift the demand curve and the supply curve in labor markets. Then we'll do the same thing with financial markets, looking at how they're different from a traditional market for goods and services. And then we'll talk about how a market is an efficient mechanism for information and kind of what that means. Because economists, we really love our markets, and we generally tend to think that, you know, they are efficient because they are emergent order. They come from individual decision making. And so the order of a market emerges from those individual decisions, and that's where the information comes from. So we'll talk about that at the end of the chapter to wrap this up. So we want to think about lots of different kinds of markets, and not all markets behave exactly like a good or service market would. Hiring workers is not the same as buying shoes or buying tires. And so when we think about labor markets, it can help give us some pretty great insight into what's going on in the real world. So you can think about the reality that we have an aging population, right? As the baby boomers retire and age and continue to age, they're going to need increased medical services, and that's altered the demand for nursing and other kinds of healthcare professionals. And so that's going to change the nature of that specific labor market. And that's one of the examples we'll be looking at today in this chapter. So the first thing we want to talk about is what a labor market is. It's just like a normal market. There's going to be a demand and a supply. The demand for labor markets is workers trying to hire, firms trying to hire workers. Demand is created by firms trying to hire workers. And we're going to expect demand in a labor market to behave, sorry about that, like demand in a goods or services market, right? We're going to expect it to behave normally and obey that law of demand. So what we're going to have in our labor market, we can get rid of this. This is a little bit too close for comfort for me, is we're going to have, in a normal goods and service market, we have quantity down here, but here it's going to be the quantity of labor. So it's going to be things like labor hours or the number of workers hired, that kind of thing. I think in our first couple of examples, we'll be talking about the number of workers. So let's do that for now. So we'll call it quantity of workers. And then up here in the price or the cost area, it's going to be the value of labor. So when we talk about value of labor, what we're saying is, what are workers going to be compensated with, and what are workers going to respond to, and what are firms going to use to attract workers? And so that's going to be generally wages. Now, we know in the real world that wages are not the only form of compensation, but we're going to simplify it because this is a model, it's not real life, and we're going to just talk about wages for our purposes. So I'm going to put wages up here, and then we're going to have demand in the labor market be downward sloping, because as wages go up, firms are going to hire fewer workers. If wages go down, firms will want to hire more. Let's say you're running a coffee shop. If you have to pay each of your workers $30 an hour versus if you have to pay each of your workers $10 an hour, that's going to have an effect on how many workers you hire. So we're going to expect to see that law of demand play out here, where higher wages are going to decrease the quantity of labor demanded by employers, and lower wages are going to increase the quantity demanded by employers. So we're going to have a labor demand curve that looks like this. As wages go up, firms are going to demand and employ fewer workers. Make sense so far? The supply side is usually easier to think about because the supply in the labor market is given by people who want a job, or at the very least want to be paid. And so think about how much money you would have to be offered to go to work. Maybe you're working now, so think about what your current wage is. If you aren't working now, you're a student, think about how much you would have to be paid to be willing and able to give up, 5 hours of study time, right? Or 20 hours a week. So what we're going to see is the labor supply market is going to obey the law of supply. As wages go up, more workers are going to be willing and able to work. As wages go down, fewer workers will be willing to work. And so we'll have an upward sloping labor supply curve. Let's label this. This is our labor market. And we'll have specific markets. We can have the market for coffee shop employees, the market for surgeons, the market for mechanics, the market for teachers, that kind of thing. And just like in a traditional market, we're going to have an equilibrium. When quantity of labor supplied is equal to quantity of labor demanded, we're going to have an equilibrium quantity of workers and an equilibrium wage. And that's going to be the point at which all of these firms who are willing and able to pay the equilibrium wage hire all of these workers who are willing and able to accept the equilibrium wage and go to work for that wage. So far, so good? Does that kind of make sense intuitively? Okay. So here is the example. We have an example of the demand and supply of nurses in the nurse labor market. We can see here the equilibrium quantity of nurses is somewhere around maybe 42,000, and the equilibrium salary for nurses is going to be, about $85,000. So the demand curve represents the willingness to pay salaries for nurses and the willingness to hire nurses. The supply curve represents the willingness of people qualified to be a nurse to supply their labor to the market. And so there are people down here willing to work for less, people up here willing to work for requiring more, and when we're in equilibrium, everything's fine. If wages are too high, let's say this is, we'll call this wage 2, we're going to have an excess supply of labor and not enough demand. So if we look at the example in the textbook and on the slides, if salaries for nurses increases to $90,000, more people will be willing and able to supply their labor to the market, but fewer places are going to be willing and able to hire them. They'll find a way to make their existing employees do more. Maybe they'll cut hours, something like that. And so what we would have is a labor surplus. What do we call it when we have too many workers and not enough jobs? Labor surplus is the same as unemployment, right? When wages are too high, we'll have a labor surplus or unemployment. Cool? What if wages are too low? If wages are too low, let's bring it down to here with wage 1, then we're going to have not many people willing to supply their labor to the market, but lots of firms willing and able to hire those workers. They're going to say, hey, we could double our staff at these prices. So if wages are down below equilibrium, more hospitals and home health care services are going to hire nurses, but not enough nurses are going to want to work for that. They'll say, to heck with it. I didn't go to school for all these years to make that amount of money. I'm going to go back to working at the coffee shop or something. And so what we would have then is a shortage of labor. So if wages are too low, we're going to have a labor shortage. And that's really similar to what we talked about when we talked about the market for goods and services, right? Excess demand or a shortage, excess supply or a surplus, and that's just going to be what happens when we're not in equilibrium. So that's pretty familiar, hopefully, relative to Chapter 3. So what's different is the way these curves shift. We talked about shifting the curves last time. So remember, there's movement along a curve, but then there's also shifting the curve. And the shifting of a curve is going to occur when there is a change in a non-price determinant. So changing wages is just going to move us along those curves. Other things are going to affect the labor markets by shifting labor demand and labor supply. So if we have a labor demand curve here, this is demand for, let's say, teachers. Oops. What's going to cause employers to hire more teachers? Well, it could be demand for output. If we have more students, we need more teachers in those classrooms to create the education for those students. If we're talking about the market for, this is my favorite. I'm just going to use it because I love it. The market for people who make pizza. If there's an increase in demand for pizza, we'll see an increase in demand for people who make pizza. We can also see the labor demand curve shift if there's a change in the number of workers or the number of firms hiring workers, if there's a change in government regulation around the requirements for workers, if there's a change in the cost of the other inputs, and if there's a change in the education, training, and technology. And so when we think about technology changing, what we want to think about is whether the technology is a complement to workers or a substitute. So an increase in robots that assemble cars is not going to increase demand for factory workers. It'll decrease demand for factory workers. But an increase in computer technology has increased demand for people who can use computers. And so the effect of technology is going to be a little bit different. And then with education and training, what we want to think about is this idea of human capital, which we haven't talked about yet, and I don't know if we'll talk about it much in this class, but it's this idea that education and training are important for workers. So if workers are appropriately educated, then firms are going to demand those workers. And so it's about having the right pool of labor. So what we're going to tend to see is that if the workforce is well trained and is educated, then employers are going to want to hire from that labor pool, whereas if they aren't, they won't. And so this gets more to the idea that there's multiple labor pools and the idea that, you don't hire from anybody to be a teacher. So you need people who have a certain amount of training, and that's going to be a function of government regulations. And so if there are more people educated and trained well to be a teacher or a nurse or a doctor or a lawyer or something like that, that's going to increase demand for workers in that market. Does that kind of make sense? So we have demand for the output, we have the education and training of workers in that field so that they're appropriately skilled to do the job. We have technology, which can either increase the productivity of the workers or replace the workers and reduce demand. We have the number of firms, which more firms, more workers, demand shifts out. Fewer firms, fewer workers, demand shifts in. We have government regulations, which a great example of that is not long ago there was a bill put forth for Californians to vote on that looked at requiring nurses to be present at dialysis clinics. If that happened, if that bill passed, it would mean that dialysis clinics would need a certain number of nurses present in case something went wrong, right? That's a government regulation that would increase demand for nurses because now more places need nurses than did before. Another example, since we're talking about nurses, think about regulations around school nurses. Some schools have full-time nurses. If we change regulations and say, listen, schools don't need a full-time nurse, they need a part-time nurse, that's more than enough, you know, anybody can put a Band-Aid on a kid, then that's going to reduce demand for nurses. Does that make sense? And then price and availability of other inputs. This is really cool because the reality is that if we just add more workers to a situation, we're going to get that diminishing marginal effectiveness of those workers. So we need other equipment and inputs to help increase demand for workers. And the way I like to think about it is it's easier if we're in a classroom together, but think about it like this. If we were all in a classroom together and I had one computer and I wanted us to work on a project together, how many people would I want to come help me work on the project with my one computer? Maybe one, maybe two. If I have 10 computers, though, how many people do I want to come work on the project? The demand for labor goes up when the availability of other inputs goes up. If I have 50 computers, I'm going to want a lot more people working with me than if I only have one, because those other inputs are going to make the workers more productive. And that's the way you want to think of it. And that's one of the things we'll talk about is labor demand comes from the productivity of those workers and the value of those workers' productivity. And that's what we're going to tend to see. That's how you kind of want to think about this. Okay? So that's demand. What about supply? Labor supply is a little bit more straightforward. And this is going to get messy now because I didn't leave enough space. But what's going to shift labor supply are going to be, first of all, the population, right? The number of workers in the labor market or in the community. It's going to be, and this can be based on birth rates. It can also be based on immigration. It can be shifted by required education levels. So one of the things, I used to have a nurse in one of my classes, and she talked about how the requirement to take licensing exams made it harder to be a nurse. That's a required education, and that raises the cost of supplying your labor to the market. Think about it. If you wanted to go out and start a new job tomorrow, could you wake up and become a nurse, wake up and become a teacher, or wake up and drive for Uber? The requirements in terms of education, training, licensing, etc., are going to determine who can supply their labor to those markets. And so that gets to both the required education and the idea of government policies, right? So if we pass a new rule that says everybody who wants to be a police officer has to take the SATs and get a certain score, that's going to affect the supply of labor in that market. The other thing that affects labor supply that's not in the slides, but I think is useful because it's something that we can relate to, is the trade-off between leisure and labor. Because the reality is we get joy, we get utility, we get enjoyment and value out of leisure time. And so we will decide how much labor to supply on the market based on our attitudes around work versus leisure time. And we see that around the world where there's different attitudes towards work, and that's based on cultural differences in how people feel about leisure. So that will also shift the labor supply, but it's really hard to quantify that. So the textbook doesn't talk about it. So we can see demand shift if the output that the workers create changes, if there's a change in government regulations or education requirements or the education of the labor pool, that's going to affect how much employers are going to demand from the labor market. Technology can either make workers more productive or replace workers, increasing or decreasing the demand. And then the number of firms, more workers. On the supply side, the number of workers, either from birth rates or immigration, the required education, and the government policies are going to have a big factor in shifting labor markets, labor supply. So think about this. How do new technologies affect the wages in general? Is it different for high-skilled workers than it is for low-skilled workers? It is. So how is it going to be different? Think about the example I gave just a minute ago, the difference between someone working in an office on a computer versus someone working in a factory. How might it be different for those two workers in those two situations? We can apply what we know here and what we learned in Chapter 3 about analyzing shifts in the supply and demand market to help answer this question. So let's go ahead and grab a bigger whiteboard so I can answer this question for you. Give me just one. Okay. You know it's a good day when I've got both whiteboards out. So what we're going to do is look at the market for high-skilled labor and low-skilled labor together. And this is really useful for a couple of reasons. One of them is that it'll help us practice our skills for analyzing shifts in supply and demand in markets for goods and services and in labor markets, but also it'll help us understand how labor markets work and how there's actually multiple labor markets everywhere. So hold on one sec. Okay, that should work. There we go. Sorry. Okay, so now we're going to have two labor markets. We're going to have the market for highly skilled workers and the market for low skilled workers or less skilled workers. And we're going to have the quantity of labor down here on both sides. And we're going to have their wages up here on both sides. Okay? And we're just going to assume that we've got some demand and some supply for workers in both of these situations. So we can assume that there's demand for high-skilled workers here, and a supply for those workers here, and the same for low-skilled workers. And the idea is if I am, and no, I don't mean in any way to denigrate factory work. I actually have a lot of family and friends who work at factories out in Indiana where a lot of my family and friends live, and it's great. They have great lives, they love their jobs, or they don't care about their jobs and they go home and have a great life afterwards. So no judgment at all about different kinds of work. We're just going to talk about sort of how there might be different effects from the same thing. How one thing changing, increases in technology, might affect different labor markets in different ways. So we're going to put our initial equilibrium quantity and wage here, and our initial wage and quantity of labor here. And then we want to think about, how do we think a change in technology is going to alter the labor market for high-skilled workers? Let's think about computer programmers. Let's think about people, sort of white collar jobs, people in offices, people working in the medical field, people working in generally higher skilled positions, people with a high level of education maybe. Are we going to see technology, first of all, is it going to affect supply or demand of labor? It's going to affect demand, right? It's going to affect how productive these workers are. And is it going to be positive or negative? We're going to increase technology. And so the way I like to think about this is think about long ago, the 80s, when technology was relatively primitive, relative to now, right? So that's 40 years later. In between the 80s and the 2020s, what has been the change in technology, and how would that affect highly skilled labor? We've seen an increase in demand, and we can see this if we go and look at employment information at online. If you look at the data, we see an increase in the demand and the employment in those high skilled jobs. Because that increase in technology means those highly skilled workers are going to tend to be more productive than they were in the 80s. And so we're going to demand more workers in that market, and we're going to pay them higher wages. And we've seen that, right? That's what we see is for those who are in markets that use a lot of technology, they've had more jobs, higher wages, better benefits overall. What about lower skilled workers, people working in factories? There's been some technological advances in food service and customer service, but not in really big ways. What we see more is replacements, right? Think about customer service jobs in restaurants and stores. We see more computers being used for ordering at fast food places and other types of restaurants. We see more auto checkout stands, fewer people being employed. That's technology replacing those low-skilled workers, whether it's in a factory or in a shop. And so that's going to have the effect of decreasing demand for those lower-skilled workers, meaning there are fewer of those jobs and the wages have gone down. Does that make sense? So what happened? We had one thing happen, an increase in technology, and it had two different effects on two different markets. For highly skilled workers, more jobs, higher wages. For less skilled workers, fewer jobs, lower wages. And that kind of makes sense when we think about what's been going on in our labor market. We've seen huge advances in technology, and it tends to accrue benefits for some and harm others. Cool? Kind of? Okay, hopefully that makes sense. Let's go back to the textbook slides. Okay, so here we have the textbook's example, and it's the same thing, right? We have low-skilled labor, which has a decrease in demand because now technology is replacing a lot of those low-skilled labor jobs. And then over here in the high-skilled labor market, we have new technologies increasing demand for fields for things like anything that has to use a computer, right? There's more jobs with that kind of more technical stuff. And it's technology that's making the workers more efficient. When you increase the productivity of the worker, you increase demand for their labor. So we see the benefits accrue differently to different groups. What are those benefits? Usually they're going to be wages. So what do we do for our low-skilled labor in this situation? Remember, we have, so these are some terms that you should be generally familiar with. We have salary or wage, which is just the money paid for service. A wage is usually hourly. Salary is usually monthly or annually. And then minimum wage is a price floor. We talked about price floors and price controls in Chapter 3. A minimum wage is just a price floor for wages. It says, listen, it is illegal to pay someone less than this certain hourly wage. And there's a lot of different rules for minimum wages. There is the federal minimum wage, which is relatively low. If you live in California, we actually have a relatively high minimum wage. There can also be local minimum wages. So I believe the Bay Area is working on having a better minimum wage than California because of the cost of living. There's also other rules about it. So for example, in some states, not California, you can pay workers who are expected to receive tips less than the minimum wage. So for example, if you're a waiter or a waitress and the minimum wage is say $5.75 or $8, they can pay you $3 an hour because the expectation is your tips will make up the remainder. So there's a lot of complicated rules about minimum wage, and there's some ways around it. Alternative to the minimum wage is the idea of a living wage. A living wage is the amount of money a full-time worker would need to afford essentials like healthcare, housing, and everything else. And so if we want to look at the effect of minimum wage laws, there's a couple of interpretations. The standard economic interpretation of any flat price floor is going to look like what you see in your textbook. So we have our quantity of labor, and we have our wage up here, because that's the value, that's the compensation to our workers. I need a new blue pen, that one was dying on me. And so we're going to have our demand for labor and our supply of workers to the market. And the idea is that there is some equilibrium wage in this market. So maybe the equilibrium wage is $10, and the equilibrium quantity of workers is 1,200 workers in the market. If the minimum wage is above the equilibrium wage at, say, $12, then it's going to be what's known as a binding constraint. What it's going to do is it's going to increase the supply of workers, right? So that's how many people want to work. And what's going to happen to the demand for workers? The number of jobs in the market is going to go down. So if demand for workers goes down to 700 with the minimum wage of $12, but the supply of workers goes up to 1,600, then what we're going to see is we have excess supply of labor. What that means in very literal terms is that we're going to have unemployment, right? We're going to have 900 unemployed people. And that's the standard economics of it, right? The idea here is that when wages are high, more people are willing to work and fewer firms want to hire. They put more responsibility on existing workers, find ways around using labor, and more people are going to tend to be unemployed. Is this always true? It depends. There's a lot of debate about this. Some people say that the minimum wage was originally designed to be a living wage. If you look at it and correct for inflation, and we'll talk more about inflation as we move through the semester, the purchasing power of the minimum wage has not kept up. It's actually dropped a lot over time, the federal minimum wage. And it used to be, there's a myth that the minimum wage workers are, brand new workers and young people, teenagers. And so the argument is this is going to lead to unemployed teenagers. But a lot of people who are supporting families end up making minimum wage. And so it's gotten to be a much more complex issue than it might have once been. But the standard economic analysis doesn't lie, right? What we see here is if this is the equilibrium and more people supply their work and more firms decide that they are no longer willing and able to pay that higher wage, we are going to see an increase in unemployment. Okay? So now we can move on to financial markets. And when we're talking about financial markets, it's going to be like labor markets where it's a little bit different to think of the supply side and the demand side. And so when we're talking about financial markets, we're going to have the same general framework, but our quantity is going to be financial capital. So it's going to be basically money being lent and borrowed. And that's what we mean when we talk about financial capital. Okay? And then when we talk about the cost of money, right, the price up here, with labor, it was wages. In the financial market, we're going to be talking about the interest rate, because that's the cost of borrowing. If you want to take out a loan, you have to pay an interest rate. But it's also the benefit of saving. And it's less true now, but if you put money in a savings account at a good institution, they'll pay you a little bit of interest on that money. And so our cost of borrowing and our benefit of saving is going to be our interest rate. It's the price of money. And financial capital is going to be our quantity of money. And then we're going to have a demand curve that represents demand for financial capital. So our demand curve is going to be made up of borrowers, and our supply curve is going to be made up of savers. And so the idea here is that when you go, let's say you get a big check, maybe it's, I used to do this when I'd get my financial aid check, I'd go and deposit it all at once in the bank and feel really wealthy for a while. So if I go and do that, I go deposit a big check in a checking account or a savings account, I now become part of the supply of capital, financial capital, a supplier in the financial market. So savers are people putting money into the bank. And then the bank takes your money and turns around and loans it out to other people. That's how banks make money. So borrowers demand loans, savers put money in the bank to get an interest rate, and there's going to be an upward sloping supply curve and a downward sloping demand curve. Because if I asked you to put $100 in a savings account today, what would you say? If you were me, you'd say, why? No, maybe, maybe not. What if I told you I'd give you $1 a month for putting $100 in a savings account? What if I told you I'd give you $10 a month for keeping that $100 in a savings account? That's that upward sloping supply curve. The higher the interest rate, the more likely savers are going to save and put money in the bank. So that's going to be an upward sloping supply of financial capital. The downward sloping demand curve says, hey, if you're going to borrow money, the interest rate is the extra you have to pay back. The more expensive that interest rate is, the less you're going to want to borrow. The cheaper it gets to borrow, the lower the interest rate, the more I'm going to want to borrow and take on that financial capital. So we're going to have a downward sloping demand curve. We're going to be in equilibrium when we see the quantity supplied of financial capital be equal to the quantity demanded. So it's going to end up looking actually pretty similar. I like to use a lowercase I for interest rate. It just makes me happy. The last thing here is usury laws. These are laws that impose an upper limit on the interest rate that lenders can charge. And so the idea is that there is supposed to be some regulation to keep banks and other lenders from taking advantage of consumers. Okay? So here we have an example of a market for loanable funds for financial capital. We have the upward sloping supply curve. As interest rates go higher and higher, people are more and more willing to save money. We have a downward sloping demand curve. As interest rates fall, people will demand more money, borrow more money. At equilibrium, we have an equilibrium quantity of loans, of money being saved and borrowed, and equilibrium interest rate. If the interest rate is too low, there are going to be more people wanting to borrow and no one wants to save. If the interest rate is too high, we'll have a surplus of financial capital, more people saving and no one borrowing. Okay? Straightforward, hopefully. Kind of makes sense? Cool. In the market here, we could be talking about loans from a bank. We could also be talking about credit card debt. We have our demand curve, we have our supply curve, and we have our equilibrium. The equilibrium interest rate in the textbook is going to be a 15% interest rate with the total quantity of capital being borrowed and loaned being $600 billion in the United States. The higher the interest rate, we're going to see higher rates of saving and lower rates of borrowing. Lower interest rates, we're going to have lower rates of saving and higher rates of borrowing. Either way will be out of equilibrium. Cool? If we look at the initial equilibrium, which we said was going to be an interest rate of 15%, and I'm sorry, I hate it when people do this. I just did the same thing. The textbook calls it R, so I'll do that too. If we impose an interest rate price ceiling or an usury law, what we're going to end up doing is creating inefficiency. So let's say the market interest rate is 15%, like in the last example, but the US government says, hey, that's too high. We're going to set the limit at 10%, and that's going to be a price ceiling, a limit on how high interest rates can be. What's that going to do? It's going to create an inefficiency in the market. We're going to see a lot of people demanding loans, demanding financial capital, but no one willing to save because there's not enough of a return. So what we would have is excess demand or a shortage of loanable funds. And that would create a market inefficiency. That would be a problem, right? We have lots of borrowers and not enough lenders. And so what we want to avoid is these kinds of market interventions. And if you ever get confused, it can be kind of confusing. A binding price ceiling is below equilibrium, and a binding price floor is above equilibrium. So you can always think about it intuitively. If you want to charge 15% and I set the law at 16%, you're fine. But if you want to charge 15 and I won't let you, I'm only letting you charge 10, then you're in trouble. The other way I like to think about it is if you were a little tiny person standing here and your ceiling was beneath you, that would be problematic. Or if the floor was above you, you'd be in trouble. So that's when we're going to see these price controls affect the market. Okay? Okay, cool. So what else is weird about financial decisions? The other weird thing about financial decisions is that they involve intertemporal decision making. Most goods we decide we're going to consume today. If I am hungry for lunch, I go out and decide I'm going to buy a sandwich. I'm going to get a soda. I'm going to drink some water. But a lot of financial decisions are actually made across time, usually making decisions for the future. I'm saving up for something I want to do a year from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now. I'm borrowing money against future earnings. That's a really good, what's a good example of intertemporal decision making? You're actually probably doing a lot more of it than you think. If you're saving up to buy a car or get your own place, if you're borrowing money to go to school with the expectation of earning higher wages, or if you're even just making the financial decision to put off going into the labor market to wait and go to school with the anticipation of getting a higher wages. Those are all intertemporal decision making. And it's going to make your market choices and your economic choices be a little more complicated because it's not just about what you're doing now, it's also about the future. Okay? So that can make it really complicated. And that's one of the things that makes financial markets so different. One thing we can think about when we're applying this idea of financial markets is we can think about the effect of U.S. debt. So if you ever listen to people talk, and we're going to talk about a lot of stuff that comes up commonly in this class because macroeconomics talks a lot about big national issues, we can think about the market for U.S. debt. So the United States tends to spend more than it makes. And we'll talk about this as we get into these models more, but we earn revenue as a country through mostly tax revenue, but also other sources. And then if we want to do things like build roads, fund the army, build schools, those kinds of things, that requires money. If we don't have enough, we can borrow from other countries. And we do that by issuing public debt. We issue debt instruments like bonds to other countries. The two top countries, the two top owners of U.S. debt tend to be either Japan or China. They kind of keep taking turns being the biggest borrowers, the biggest, not borrowers, the biggest consumers of our debt, the biggest lenders to us. And so when we think about the market for U.S. debt, we can think about there being a supply of financial capital where there are countries like China and Japan willing and able to lend us money, and there's demand for financial capital. The United States is out there borrowing money in order to engage in military spending and build rocket ships for NASA and those kinds of things. And then there's an equilibrium with a rate of return associated with it, where those countries make money off of our debt over time and the expectation that we will pay them back. And so it's an interesting thing to think about. We'll talk about this more as we start to talk about the real hard macro models, talking about international trade, talking about how we fuel our economy. We'll see what the effect of all that U.S. debt is over time. But we can think about the idea here of what would shift the market for U.S. debt. And so if we see the U.S., and this could happen to any country, this happens a lot to developing countries, they might look like a good investment, and then over time, other countries might change their mind or just be less willing to buy up their debt to supply financial capital. If, say, Japan decides, you know, U.S., we don't like you anymore. We don't want to borrow your money. We don't want to borrow, or we don't want to lend you any more money. That would have the effect of shifting the supply curve in, raising interest rates, and reducing our ability to borrow financial capital. Does that make sense? Kind of? Okay. So when we think about these models, how do we explain them being an efficient mechanism for information? What we're talking about here is the idea that the model of demand and supply, which is the second big fundamental model in this course, helps us understand existing levels of whatever good or service, labor, cookies, financial capital, nurses, shoes. It helps us understand the current context, price, quantity, willingness to pay, willingness to supply. And it also helps us understand how different phenomenon, how different events might affect those equilibria, affect those quantities, and affect those amounts. So we can use this model to describe a lot of things. We have our horizontal axis that shows us the quantity of a good or a service, the quantity of labor in a given job market or for a given job, and the quantity of financial capital. And then on the vertical axis, we have the cost of that behavior, the price of a good or a service, the wage of labor, the wage that workers are willing to accept and firms are willing to pay, or the rate of return or interest rate associated with financial capital or other debt instruments. And so all of that is a lot of information contained in a pretty simple model. And what we see when we change demand and supply, when we run through these examples, is producer behavior and consumer behavior and what our expectations about those can be. Price controls are going to limit our ability to understand what's actually going on. And a great example of that is the example of rent control. There's a really great model that looks at, I'm not going to show you the whole thing because it's kind of complicated, but there's a really great model that says, hey, when you impose a rent control, you limit the signal, the informational efficiency of a given market. So let's say we've got, oh, that's a terrible pen. the market for housing, and we have some demand for housing, and these are going to be apartments, and some supply. We're going to say this is a 2-bedroom, 1-bathroom apartment, right? That's our market. And we're going to put it in equilibrium. And then we're going to impose rent control. We're going to say, hey, this is the price of a 2-bedroom apartment from now on. What happens when we have an increase in the population? More people come in, we see an increase in demand. But we're stuck with this rent control, so we're going to see demand exceed supply, and we're going to have a housing shortage. But what else happens? If the price doesn't go up, investors don't get the signal that there are people willing and able to pay more for apartments. And they don't build more housing, so the supply stays the same, rather than increasing as they decide to build more apartments. And that's problematic. What happens if, and that's what we mean. That's what we mean is that without this information, buyers and sellers can't react to the changes in the economy. With a price ceiling, sellers don't know that they could make more money if they produced more, and so they're just stuck. And over time, it tends to get worse. So when we think about markets, we tend to think about them being informationally efficient. So we have just the same exact thing here. We have a horizontal axis showing the quantity of goods, services, quantity of labor, quantity of capital. We have our vertical axis showing the price, the wage, or the rate of return. Then we have our equilibrium, our demand curve, and our supply curve. And really, we use this model a lot because we believe it does a really good job of helping us understand how these things work. So bringing it all the way back full circle, just like we talked about in the beginning, if we look at the market for labor for nurses, there is a specific labor market, and there are education and regulation requirements associated with becoming a nurse. As we see baby boomers age, we see the demand for medical services and the demand for nurses increase. And we're going to expect that to increase salary for nurses. So as time goes on, we're going to expect the median salary for a nurse to increase from $75,330 to higher rates because that demand is going to continue to increase. And we're not going to be able to increase the supply very easily because of the education restriction requirements associated with becoming a nurse. Okay? So if, on the other hand, we see demand for nurse increase and the supply increases because some of those baby boomers might be nurses who are also retiring, and maybe we're seeing tuition get more expensive. We've definitely seen huge growth in the cost of education and especially the cost of textbooks. That's going to actually reduce the supply of nurses, which is going to raise wages, raise salaries for nurses even more. So we don't know what might happen in the future, but we can tend to expect that wages and salaries for nurses are going to tend to go up because of those two forces happening at the same time in the market. And we can track whether we're right or not by looking at nurses' salaries and employment rates over time. Cool? Okay, that's it. I'm sorry the video cut out there a little bit at the end. Hopefully it's not a huge impact. I think it's only about a minute's worth. But that's labor markets and financial markets. So this is a great chapter to both review market forces of supply and demand, get a new sense of other ways we can apply that market model, and then also prep us for thinking about markets in national terms. So rather than thinking about the sort of micro view of a worker and a job, thinking about unemployment rates. And instead of just thinking about markets for simple things like buying shoes, thinking about global markets and national markets for national debt and inflation and national interest rates. Interest rates are going to play a really big role in what we talk about here. So that's going to be really useful, and this is going to help us understand our macro as we move on our macro journey. So let me know what questions you have. Make sure to check out all the assignments on Canvas. Feel free to reach out if there's anything that's not clear, anything you have any other questions or concerns about, and I'll do my best to either answer it for you or produce another video or try to give you another explanation or another resource. But otherwise, I'll see you next time. Take care.